So, hello, we're continuing on with informal fallacies here. Remember, these are fallacies, which fallacies in general are errors in reasoning, and a formal fallacy would be a fallacy involving an inappropriate form of an argument, that is, the inappropriate structure or pattern of an argument. And an informal fallacy, that doesn't mean it's a casual fallacy, it just means that it's a fallacy that the problem is something other than the form of the argument. And usually it's the content of the argument. There's something wrong about it, right? There's something problematic about the content of the argument itself. And in fact, some examples of informal fallacies or arguments that include an informal fallacy, the argument itself might actually be deductively valid, but since there's an informal fallacy, we know that the argument turns out to be problematic, maybe even deductively unsound, but problematic one way or another. So here's sort of the most straightforward example of fallacies involving unwarranted assumptions, right? This is where the one or more of the premises requires some kind of extra support that's not provided in the argument itself. So yeah, here's the most straightforward one, is circular reasoning. So this is when the conclusion is actually stated as one of the premises, or it's assumed as one of the premises. That is, acceptance of the premises requires previous acceptance of the conclusion. So you can't use those premises as independent support for the conclusion, because in order to accept the premise, you need to accept the conclusion. So here's a really straightforward one. Suppose you're trying to convince an atheist to believe in God, and you say, well, God exists, therefore God exists. Like, okay, well, this actually is a deductively valid argument. If the premise is true, then the conclusion is guaranteed to be true. But that's because the premise and the conclusion are the exact same thing. So this is a very clear example of a circular argument. Somewhat fancier version of the exact same thing is the second one we have here. So the Bible says God exists. Everything in the Bible is true, so therefore God exists. Okay, so that sounds like a somewhat more reasonable argument than the first one. And it certainly is true, this first premise, that the Bible says that God exists. That's sort of what the Bible's all about. But it's the second premise, right? Everything in the Bible is true. Why might somebody believe that? Well, they might believe it because they might believe that the wording of the Bible was inspired directly by God. Right? The humans who actually wrote it, physically wrote it, they were inspired by this divine being. And so everything that they end up writing down is exactly true. Well, the only reason you would believe that that's happening is if you already believe that God exists to be able to do that. So the only reason, or the primary reason, that you would believe that everything in the Bible is true is because you believe that God does in fact exist. And so this is a little more subtle example, but still this is circular reasoning. In order to accept both those premises, you need to already accept the conclusion. Okay, a couple others here, easy examples. I always tell the truth, therefore what I'm saying is true. Like, well, okay, that's not independent support for what I'm saying is true. The universe has existed forever, therefore the universe is infinitely old. Like, it doesn't matter if we rephrase things in a slightly different way, if it's got the same propositional content in the premise and the conclusion, then this is straightforward circular reasoning. By the way, one note that I almost hesitate to mention here, this is also called begging the question. And that phrase, begging the question, or to beg the question, or this begs the question, that's nowadays very often used as sort of synonymous with it prompts us to ask the question, right? So something has happened, so maybe it's a little mysterious, or somebody's giving us some explanation for something, but it's incomplete. We say, oh, well, that begs the question that, and then we ask a question, sort of a follow-up question for greater clarification. But in logic and in philosophy, begging the question just means this, circular reasoning, that the conclusion has been assumed in the premises somehow. Okay. So next one up, false dilemma. This is unjustifiably claiming that there's only two options when you should know, or maybe you do know, that there's actually more than just those two. So this is another example where we could have a deductively valid argument, because oftentimes an argument containing a false dilemma is a disjunctive syllogism. And so you might remember back in chapter 1, this is the disjunctive syllogism argument form. It says, first premise says that either that A is true or B is true. And so one of those has to be true according to the first premise. And then the second premise then goes on to say that, well, A, whatever A is not true. So if either A or B has to be true, at least one of them has to be true, and now we're told that A is not true, well, then it's got to be B is the one that's true. So this is a deductively valid argument. And so for any consistent substitution of A and B, this is going to be deductively valid. So let's look at an example. So the Mets or the Rockies will win the World Series next season. The Mets will not win the World Series next season, so therefore the Rockies will win the World Series next season. Well, this is a deductively valid argument. If it's true that these are the only two options, the Mets or the Rockies, for winning the World Series, and if it's true that the Mets won't win, well, then the Rockies will. But of course, that first premise is a false dilemma. There's all these other teams that have a legitimate chance at least making it to the World Series and maybe winning it. And in fact, the Mets or the Rockies might not be the best candidates for winning the next World Series. So we definitely know that there's more options than just those two. So that first premise is sort of, in a technical sense, it's false. And so while this is a deductively valid argument, it's clearly not deductively sound. Here's another example, a video example of a false dilemma. So this, I think, is going down as perhaps the most famous false dilemma argument in American political history. So this was around 2002 when the George W. Bush administration was trying to rally support for going to war in Iraq. And so this was a really common argument that George W. Bush would present in his speeches.
Either you're with us, either you love freedom and with nations which embrace freedom, or you're with the enemy. There's no in between. If you're with us, you're with the enemy. Make that clear. Either you're with us.
And so, so he's presented like either you're in favor of going to war in Iraq, you're in favor of the Iraq invasion, or you're in favor of terrorism. Like those are your only two options. Well, certainly I'm not in favor of terrorism. I mean, this was just very soon after the 9/11 attacks. And so absolutely, we're not in favor of terrorism, very strongly, more strongly than normal during that time period. And so I guess our only other option is to invade Iraq, which Iraq had nothing really to do with the 9/11 attacks. So clearly there's other options. Clearly it's possible to be against terrorism and also to be against invading Iraq, which in fact did, of course, turn out to be a huge disaster, and lots of people were trying to make that case at the time, but so many people were sort of drawn in by this false dilemma argument by George W. Bush that, well, obviously it got support, and quite a lot of support in Congress even. All right, moving on. So appeal to unreliable authority, right? This is a real common one as well. So you have some person that either is or seems to be an authority figure of some kind, and they are advocating some policy or some conclusion, some belief of one kind or another. But it turns out that either they're just not an authority or an expert on anything at all, or they're speaking outside their area of expertise, right? So they are an expert in one area, but they're trying to convince us of something that's outside their area. And so just because they are an authority in one area doesn't mean that we should trust what they have to say about something outside their area of expertise. So some examples, well, most celebrity endorsements have this form, right? So they are advocating maybe some governmental policy, or they're just advertising a product of some kind. So why should I buy this brand of watch or this kind of car? Is it because this authority says that I should? Like, well, they're not an expert in sort of what I should buy and what I shouldn't buy, or what policies I should enact or not enact. And so they're just being paid usually to promote this idea. And so they're just outside their area of expertise for sure. Now, if they're presenting, talking about something that is in their area of expertise, so if it's a famous actor and they're talking about acting, well then great. Well, now they are an authority, perhaps. If they're a good actor, then they're perhaps a good authority in that area, and we should pay attention to them. But usually a celebrity endorsement is the celebrity speaking about something outside their area of expertise. So yeah, that in and of itself is not a good reason for accepting what they're saying just because they're a celebrity. We sometimes have something like this, right? A famous scientist, or at least a scientist that is an expert, like a clear expert in one field, speaking outside that field, right? So a Nobel Prize winning physicist trying to tell us something about tax policy. Okay, well, maybe they have some interesting points to make, but just because they're a famous physicist or sort of an expert in physics, that in and of itself does not give us good reasons for thinking that they're have good tax policy ideas. We need some independent support. And then, of course, anytime a parent says to their kids, the kid's like, so why do I have to do my chores? And the parent says, because I said so. Like, well, yeah, the parent is in authority, but just because they say so, that in and of itself really is not a good reason for doing your chores. Now, there might be good reasons, but we need to hear those, right? If we're going to evaluate this argument, the reasons for doing your chores, we need to hear those reasons, not just appeal to authority. Okay, moving on. False cause fallacy. This is one you've probably heard of before as well. So this is unjustifiably assuming one thing is the cause of something else. And usually when this is presented, it's the two things happen like really close together in time or near each other in space. And so we then sort of jump to this conclusion that one thing caused the other. So if something terrible happens, we're not sure why, so we just start thinking about, wow, what could have caused this? And then we think, oh yeah, this other thing happened yesterday, and so maybe that thing caused this horrible thing to happen. Another example, or another way of sort of stating this, a version of this, is when people confuse correlation and causation, right? So correlation, two things happen together, or sort of the rates of these things happen, they both go up or they're both going down, and we assume that they're both going up or both going down because there's some causal connection there. So here's some examples. This is a real famous one. So some kid acts violently, maybe like very violently, in a criminal way perhaps, but it could be that they're just sort of like being a bully on the playground or something. And then we're like, well, what caused them to do that, right? Especially when it's like a really horrible event that they did, and maybe they even killed somebody. And we're just really racking our brains, like what could have done this? What could have caused them to do that? It just seems so inexplicable. And then we realize, hey, this kid was playing a violent video game. They were playing like Call of Duty or Grand Theft Auto or something like that. And so that must have been the cause of why they acted violently. Or they're listening to music that has maybe some actually somewhat disturbing or violent lyrics to it. It's like, there it is. That's the cause. That's why they acted violently. Like, well, that's just an assumption, right? We need actual scientific evidence in favor of that causal connection between playing these video games or listening to this music and this violent behavior. And in fact, that scientific research has been done, and there just really is no good justification for believing that there's a causal connection there. The next one is one I got from other students when I brought this up in another class. So they said that there's a correlation between ice cream consumption and vandalism. So yeah, when ice cream consumption goes up, vandalism goes up. So maybe eating ice cream causes you to vandalize public property. Like, well, let's think a little more carefully about this. Usually ice cream consumption goes up in the summertime. Well, that's also when most kids are out of school, and so their time isn't occupied with schoolwork and their like after school sports and events and things like that. And so they just sort of have a greater tendency to get into trouble, right? Including vandalizing, just sort of to occupy their time. And so yeah, both ice cream consumption and vandalism does go up in the summer, but for different reasons. And so they just happen to go up at the same time, and it's a little silly, but it points out how this is a fallacy of assuming that there must be a causal connection there. Another really famous one is this one, right, the vaccinations and autism. And so, this is certainly very kind of heart-wrenching when parents, maybe when their child is about 1 year old or so, they start noticing actual symptoms of autism, and their baby seemed just fine, and this autism didn't start to show up until, like I said, they're maybe about 1 year old or so, and they're just like so worked up over this, right? In anguish over this, legitimately. And so they're just wondering what could have caused this. Why is my child suddenly showing these symptoms? And they start thinking about what's happened in the recent past, like, aha, a month ago they got some vaccinations, and then they started showing these symptoms. So it must have been the vaccinations that caused the autism. Well, it turns out that there's no, lots and lots and lots of studies have been done on this, and nobody's been able to find anything like a causal connection. In fact, there's not even a very strong correlation between these two. But it turns out that autism symptoms, just typically, whether people get vaccinations or not, autism symptoms don't tend to show up until a child is sort of past the first several months, maybe getting towards a year or 2 years old. Then some of these autism symptoms start to really show themselves. And so inevitably, like, that's when most of the vaccinations are happening, during those first several months of life. And so if parents are sort of flailing about for some explanation, some cause for why their child is suddenly like this, well, it's kind of reasonable for them to latch on to this unusual event of vaccinations. Okay, next one up. Well, this is called the complex question fallacy. That's what they call it in the textbook. That doesn't give you a really good idea of what the fallacy is, but it's some question that somebody's being asked that inappropriately presupposes some conclusion that's alluded to in the question. Okay, that doesn't maybe by itself explain what it is. I think it's best explained through examples. So I've gotten a political poll before that I tried to answer in good faith, but the question was something like this, right? Do you approve of the dangerous job-killing policies of our elected officials? Well, this actually, I received this poll during a time when I did agree with the policy that was under question here. But so what do I say? Do I say yes? I approve of dangerous job-killing policies? Well, that sounds stupid, right? Why would I agree with that? And so, oh, well, so I should say no. Like, well, but I actually do agree with the government policies during that time period. So I'm sort of stuck. There's no answer that I can give that is an answer that sort of I would actually endorse. And so I've been sort of backed into this inappropriate corner here with this question. So this is an inappropriate question. So another sort of classic one that they talk about in the book a little bit is, so have you stopped beating your wife? Like, so how are you supposed to answer that? Suppose that you're a very loving, gentle person. You would never resort to violence on your spouse. But then somebody asks you this, so what's the answer? Yes, you have stopped. Well, that means that you used to be beating your wife. But if you say no, well, then that means you're continuing to beat your wife. And so you're stuck, right? There's no answer that you can give that you would actually endorse. And so this is an inappropriate kind of question. So here's the next one that they actually don't include this in the book. I was sort of surprised, but I think it's an interesting one and an important one to be aware of. So the slippery slope fallacy is inappropriately assuming that justification for taking some first step will justify taking every step to a bad conclusion. Right? So the idea is that you're at the top of a hill, just where the imagery comes from. You're at the top of a hill, there's something terrible, maybe it's just like a big mud pit or something, but something you don't like at the bottom of the hill. But, it doesn't look like that steep of a hill. You can maybe get onto the first part of it and walk along, the top of that hill. But it turns out that once you step on that hill, it's so slippery that you're going to slide all the way down to this place you don't want to be. So, the arguments about gateway drugs, maybe you've heard these, where the thought is, oh, well, it might not sound like that big of a deal to take, one little toke on a marijuana cigarette, but within a couple of weeks, you're going to be smoking crack, you're going to be addicted to methamphetamines, and your life is going to be ruined. Like, well, that doesn't seem like a very good argument, right? That it does seem like there's ways to block that slide from, experimenting maybe just a little bit with a relatively minor drug. That doesn't mean you're automatically going to slide into hopeless addiction. Gun control debates sometimes also take this form. In fact, most of the arguments that I've heard coming from the National Rifle Association against gun legislation, gun control legislation, seems to have this form. So there's some very reasonable proposals out there in front of state or federal legislatures, and that's pretty moderate gun control. And in fact, a large majority of the American population is in favor of this legislation. But the National Rifle Association will then often say, oh, well, if you pass that seemingly relatively mild gun control legislation, then it's just inevitable that the legislature is going to go all the way to confiscating everybody's guns. Like, so that doesn't seem like it's inevitable that we're going to go all the way to that extreme conclusion. There might be a way to block it, right? And so this is a fallacy when there is a legitimate way of blocking the slide, that it's okay to take that first step, and the first step is justified, and you're not going to go all the way to the bad conclusion. So here's another example. This is another little video example. This is about same-sex marriage. And it's a joking example for sure. It's sort of making fun of the slippery slope argument that was sometimes being presented in the debate. So this was, say in the mid-2000s or so, around 2007, 2008, something like that. And so we heard arguments like this.
Slippery slope guy on gay marriage. Should all people have the same rights and privileges under the law? Sure. But it's a slippery slope. First, it's two fellas tying the knot. Then the next thing you know, a guy wants to marry a donkey, or a shoe buffer, or a vending machine, and there's not a damn thing we can do about it.
Yeah, this actually, I really did legitimately hear this argument in the mid-2000s, almost word for word for the joking version that Adam Carolla gives us here. Clearly there's a way to block the move from allowing same-sex marriage to allowing people to get married to inanimate objects. I've got it down here. Marriage requires informed consent. Inanimate objects and donkeys, non-human animals, they cannot give informed consent. So they cannot legally be included in a marriage. Whereas two men or two women, right, clearly they can give informed consent. And so the justification for allowing two humans of whatever sex or whatever gender to get married does not inevitably commit us to allowing people to get married to non-human animals and to inanimate objects. This is one of those that's tricky, that there are such things as legitimate slippery slope arguments, right? That there are times where it's really true that that first step, although it might seem justified, it really is going to commit us to all the way to a bad conclusion that we're not going to want to get to. But we have to be very careful about using that sort of argument and work hard to make sure that there isn't some way of blocking that slide before we sort of state that we're going to end up at this bad conclusion. All right, so that's it for the informal fallacies section, and so I'll go ahead and stop there.